Record. And okay. Full screen mode. So we're good?
Yep.
We're good. And we are recording. Alrighty. So good evening. I'm George Hall, and this is Lecture 8, Part 1 of A Fiscal History of the United States. I want to start where we left off 2 weeks ago. In Lecture 6, we discussed the funding of the American Revolution and the subsequent fiscal crisis. This fiscal crisis led to a second American Revolution, in which the first U.S. Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation, were ripped up, and a new U.S. Constitution, the one we still have today, was adopted in its place. Now, Americans as a whole very much revere the U.S. Constitution. For example, we require our public servants to promise to uphold the Constitution when they take office. And the signers of the Constitution, people like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, they're generally considered to be some of the greatest political and philosophical minds in the history of the United States. And we could add Thomas Jefferson as author of the Bill of Rights to this list. We often describe these patriots as good, honest men. And so this Constitution that went into effect in 1789, it's a key political document, but it's also, as we discussed, a key, at the end of the last class, a key fiscal document. It's an economic document as well. And we went through the end of Lecture 6, we went through some of the economic provisions of this document. We went through it. So the Constitution is both a political document and an economic document. So, for example, it prohibits the states to issue paper money. It allows the federal government to collect duties on imports, but not on exports. And so roughly about 100 years ago, the historian Charles Beard made a very provocative argument that the Founding Fathers' motivation for tearing up the Articles of Confederation and writing this new Constitution was motivated primarily by their own personal financial interest rather than any sort of high-minded political goals. Beard went and looked at the financial motivation of the sort of key players who supported and opposed the adoption of the Constitution. And in particular, he examined the debt holdings of the Founding Fathers and just argued that they were an elite who simply wanted to, were owed a lot of money and wanted to be repaid. Now, by his own admission, he did an incomplete job. He didn't have access to all of the records. But by the mid sort of 20th century, more archival records became available. And historians such as Forrest McDonald looked at these more extensive records, and they're records that actually Tom and I have, and we've been looking at with a variety of RAs. Looked at these more extensive records and concluded that many of the signers of the Constitution and then those who voted for adopting the Constitution, ratifying the Constitution, actually had very little to personally gain in terms of debt repayments. Sort of the more contemporary, more modern historians really argue that the Constitution, the signers of the Constitution were largely motivated by a desire for political unity, national economic development, and diplomatic security. So there really has been, while this notion of, or this idea of Charles Beard, or this view of Charles Beard, is kind of, I think, no longer held, it was extremely influential in the early part of the 20th century. And furthermore, it has really sort of changed people's thinking in terms of thinking about the US Constitution not just as a political document, but an economic document. And an economic document really emphasizes an economic document that created winners and losers. There was big shifts in wealth because of the Constitution, and Charles Beard makes this point. Just as a footnote, Charles Beard was one of the founders of the New School there in Greenwich Village, in your neighborhood, your neck of the woods. So it's worth a little tidbit there. So in the 1780s, as we noted, during the American Revolution, the states themselves were responsible for many of the expenditures of the war. They spent about $77 million in carrying out the war. And while records aren't always careful and many of them were destroyed, we think they spent about $77 million in fighting the war. And by 1789, with the adoption of the Constitution, by Hamilton's estimates, there were still about $25 million unpaid. So they paid off about $50 million and still had about $25 million in state debts that remained unpaid, still remained on the books, but very impressively, it paid off about $50 million of the debt. Now, after the signing of the Constitution, George Washington becomes president, but in many ways, it's Alexander Hamilton who takes center stage. This really becomes Alexander Hamilton. He becomes Secretary of the Treasury, and he becomes the sort of a real leading force behind the new government. He's perhaps the most influential American public figure to have never served as president. In this course, we've one of the themes of this course is that we let the data, the numbers, kind of tell the story. Generally, we want to tell the story of American history through taxes, spending, and debt. Actually, one of the comments I got back on these responses from the readings, I appreciate those that did respond, was they said, one of the students said, I really enjoy learning about debt and taxes as we've been doing. You can learn almost all the history of a country by just looking at its budget constraint. And that's very much in the spirit of the class. However, I'm going to take an exception here, and I think it's worth doing an exception to actually talk about a personality and to talk about history. We'll do that only a few times in this course, but Alexander Hamilton is one who is worthy of that. He was born in the Caribbean, quite humble beginnings. His mom died at an early age. It's uncertain whether his father was ever married to his mother. He was often referred to as a bastard. Very humble beginnings, quite poor. He actually, when his mother died, he trained as a clerk in an import-export operation firm in St. Croix. And these characteristics are important. So he's an immigrant. He comes to the United States as a teenager. And thus, unlike Madison, Jefferson, Washington, he doesn't identify primarily with his home state. He thinks of himself nationally. He thinks of himself as a citizen of the United States. He's a resident of New York, and he's loyal to New York, and he represents New York, but he very much has a national point of view. Furthermore, as a teenager, he trained as a clerk in this export-import firm in St. Croix, and so he had considerable experience as a merchant. He was used to exchanging lots of different types of currencies. He was very sort of fluent in debt and money. which is in stark contrast to most of the other founding fathers. If you look at even these three that we mentioned before, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, all of them are Virginians. They all were largely landowners who had little sort of merchant experience and little experience with banking, little experience with debt or bonds or money on that. So the third thing was he served in the Revolution first as General Washington's aide-de-camp and then later as an artillery officer. And this is sort of important for two reasons. One is he sees sort of firsthand the consequences of a poorly funded government. When these guys are, freezing in these very cold winters, like in Valley Forge and other winters, he very much sees, the consequences of what happens when Congress is unable to sort of allocate the funds to properly fund an army. And then furthermore, he and Washington, so George Washington, who's going to become the first president of the United States, have a deep bond. Washington has a true bond with those that served with him in the war. Washington serves as both his mentor, and they have complete trust in each other. And this is going to be extremely helpful in terms of getting legislation through. It's in sharp contrast to people like Madison and Jefferson and John Adams, who don't serve in the war. There. One thing that's not on here is he trained as a lawyer. So he was, extremely knowledgeable in the law. He was one of the writers of the Constitution, one of the framers of the Constitution. He was one of the chief authors of the Federalist Papers. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He founded the Bank of New York. I have to say, he died at 48. And as a 49-year-old, it's hard not to look at your life and say, geez, he accomplished all this and died before he hit age 50. It's hard to keep up with that. But a very impressive background and a unique background that's different from those of his contemporaries on there. I asked you guys to read Hamilton's report in the support of public credit. I recognize that it's a very long document. It goes on and it's written, it goes on and on, particularly that last third or so goes on and on. I probably should have said just read the first 2/3 or so. Probably many of you gave up after a while, but it's a really impressive document. It's remarkably impressive. It's a great statement on debt, and many of the issues that come up are timeless. I mean, it feels many of the issues feel as current today as they were back then. So he submits this report. He's Secretary of the Treasury, and he gets asked by Congress. He tells Congress to ask him for a report on the public credit. He submits it in January of 1790, and he declares that debt was the price of liberty. It's what we paid to win our freedom from Britain. And he recommends that Congress pass a law with 4 basic components. First of all, it wants to repay the foreign debt with interest at face value. And he wants to issue a new set of bonds without a maturity date to refinance the domestic debt. And he argues that he doesn't want a maturity date because he wants to allow the economy to grow. He doesn't want to pay it back. He's not in any rush to pay it back because he wants the economy to grow before he has to pay it back. And he also makes it clear that he wants what would now be called today, in today's language, call protection. He doesn't want any call provisions in these bonds. In order to induce investors to buy these bonds, he wants to ensure that if interest rates fall, the government can't force investors to sell the bonds back to the government. So he's wants to ensure the investors against a fall in the interest rate. The third thing he wants to do is assume the state debts. This is going to be quite controversial. And then what he's going to do is note that he's going to repay the foreign debtors at face value, but he's going to actually give domestic bondholders a haircut. What he wants to do is he wants to lower the coupon rate on the debt to 4% for 10 years. He says, you're only going to get 4% for 10 years, and then after that, you're going to get 6%. And he's going to set aside money from the import duties, which in order to make the interest payments. And then later, he's going to actually argue that he's going to need even more revenue than just the import duties to make the coupon payments. But he's not going to give, remember all this previous debt that had been outstanding promised to pay a 6% coupon. And he's not going to honor 6%. He's going to cut it to 4. But he's going to say, I'm going to cut it to 4 for 10 years. Then after that, I'll pay you 6. I'll show you how he's going to do this. It's a little complicated. But what he wants to do is what he wants to do with this new constitution. He's going to remember the constitution is going to allow the federal government to get to now have control of the tariff revenue. So now they have the mother lode of tariff revenue, mother lode of revenue, tax revenue. And he wants to change people's expectations about the discounted present value of the future sum of surpluses. Okay, he wants to say, we're going to be running surpluses into the future. I'm going to be able to tax more than we spend. And that's going to raise the value of the bonds. Because remember, the market value of the debt is equal to the discounted present value of the future stream of surpluses. And what he wants to do is he wants these bonds, which were trading at 20 cents on the dollar, to trade much closer to face value. And he recognizes that the way to do that, the way you get debt to trade at face value as opposed to at a discount, is to change people's views about the revenue and the resources that are going to back that debt. And what's implicitly backing that debt are the discounted present value of future surpluses. So he says, look, even if future government spending goes up, revenue is going to go up by even more. We're going to run big surpluses. That's going to increase the value of the debt. Now, there's costs and there's benefits to this. The benefit is you're going to have a debt that trades near face value, and he's going to say there's a number of virtues to this, which we'll talk about in a minute, about the many virtues of debt that is well funded. But there's going to be some costs to that. And the costs are going to be, you're going to need to raise taxes and collect more in tax revenue than you actually spend in government spending. You're going to need to run surpluses and that. So what's good for the bondholders is not going to necessarily be good for the taxpayers. The taxpayer and the bondholders are going to have different interests. And so who's going to win in this deal are bondholders. Who's going to lose? Well, the taxpayers. They're going to have to start paying higher taxes. But those higher taxes are going to go to raise the value of the debt, the market value of the debt, to which Hamilton is going to say there's goes through and lists in that report on public credit some of the virtues of having a well-funded debt. And let's talk about some of those. Okay, well, first of all, before we talk about some of those virtues, let's first talk about the mechanics of how he's going to do it. What he's going to do is he's going to say, look, there's all these different types of debt out there. We've got loan office certificates. We've got liquidated debt certificates that were issued by the different states. We've got liquidated debt certificates that were issued by various commissioners. We've got a variety of Army debt, these Pierce certificates. We've got all these different types of securities. We've got all these different state debts as well. So we have dozens of different types of securities outstanding. And what he wants to do is consolidate them into three securities, so that there's going to be this huge consolidation of different types of debt into just a small number of securities. So these three securities are all going to be consols. That's because they're not going to have a maturity date. So they just make interest payments. Okay, so no maturity date and no call provisions on this. Now they're going to have the name stocks, and back then, prior to the U.S. Civil War, what we today call bonds, they called stocks. So a little confusing, but in the early part of the 18th century, or the 18th and 19th century, when you hear the word stock, what they mean is bond. So there's the three different securities. One is called the 6% stock, the deferred 6% stock, and the 3% stock. So the 6% stock's easy. It just pays a 6% interest rate. So it pays 6% forever with no maturity date. The 3% stock, that's also pretty simple. It makes a 3% interest rate payment or coupon payment every year, forever, and there's no maturity date. Then there's number 2, which is the deferred 6%. So what it's going to do is pay no interest until 1801, and then 6% afterwards. So it makes no payments for 10 years, and then it pays 6% after that. So in 1801, it's going to become a 6% stock, just like bond number 1 here. But up until that point, it makes no interest payment. Now, why would he do this? What he wants to do is he's going to convert all domestic federal debt. What he's going to do, say you have any kind of federal debt. Say you have a loan office certificate. So if you have $100, you have a loan office certificate that has a $100 face value. So it says, promise to just pay so-and-so $100. What you bring it into the federal treasury, and what Hamilton's going to give you is he's going to give you $66.67, going to give you 2/3 in the 6% stock, and then $33, a piece of paper that has $33 written on it, and 33 cents for 1/3 in the deferred 6% stock. So you get 2/3 6%, 1/3 deferred 6. What that has the effect of doing is, by handing you that combination of two securities, what he's doing is giving you a 4% interest rate for 10 years, a 4% coupon rate, really should say, a 4% coupon rate for 10 years, and then 6% after that. Is that clear? Let me just ask if there's ways to raise your hand actually in this if somehow things aren't clear. But well, assuming it's clear to everybody, we'll keep going. It's actually, this was not clear to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson complained bitterly that this was way too confusing. Now, the one exception to this was if you had an unpaid interest. Now recall that since the early 1780s, the Continental government could not make interest payments, and so instead, for unpaid interest, it wrote up these indents of interest, or these IOUs that were indents of interest. Now it's interesting. Back then, they didn't believe in compound interest, and they didn't believe in paying interest on interest, is the phrase. So they said an interest payment is not the same thing as principal payment. They drew a distinction we don't draw so much today. And so they said, if you've got an indent of interest, well, we'll convert that 1-to-1 into a 3% stock. Then what they said was, if you've got a state debt, what we're going to give you is some combination of these two things. We're going to kind of treat it as 2/3 principal and 1/3 interest. So if you have any state debt, doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what state it's from, you bring in a piece of an IOU that's from, the state of New York, and we're gonna divide this up by ninths. You're gonna get two, it's gonna be treated as 2/3 as like principal. So you get 4/9 or 2/3 of 2/3 in the 6% stock, and then 1/3 of 2/3 in the deferred 6% stock, and then 1/3 in the 3% stock. Now, what to do about these continental dollars? One argument could be made is they're an IOU just like any other IOU. They were, they were just pieces. Think about what they were. The government, the revolutionary government needed to get supplies to carry out the war. They took goods and services from the private sector and handed them different pieces of paper. Some of those pieces of paper might have been loan officer certificates, some of them might have been quartermaster certificates, some of them might have been continental dollars. Dollars are considered money, whereas loan officer certificates are considered bonds. And why draw this distinction? Well, Hamilton is going to draw this distinction. He's going to say, well, he's going to honor the interest-bearing debt. When it comes to the non-interest-bearing debt, or the money, the fiat currency, he's going to default on that. Essentially, it had been originally been in 1780. The Confederation government had revalued the continental dollar at one continental dollar. I'm sorry, one specie dollar for every 40 continental dollars, and they're going to change that to $1 in specie to every 100 continental dollars. So they're going to exacerbate the default to there. Foreign debt's going to be refinanced at face value. It's actually even at a 0.5% higher interest rate on that. So if we think about these two acts together, we think about the U.S. Constitution and then the Funding Act of August 4th, 1790. We can think about this as sort of a grand bargain or as a second American Revolution. What it's going to do is, as part of the Constitution, it transfers the tariff revenue from the states to the federal government. So basically, the mother lode of government revenue goes from the states to the federal government. However, in exchange for that, kind of the deal is, okay, now that you've got the revenue, the federal government is now going to take on the state debts. And so it's essentially the federal government's going to bail out the states in exchange for the tariff revenue. That's the trade. It's a grand bargain on that. That's the proposal on that. Now, this plan was extremely controversial. We know from now that it passed, but when it was originally proposed, it was sharply criticized. And in particularly, what was funny is that it was sharply criticized by James Madison, who was one of the architects of the Constitution, one of the most highly respected of the founding fathers, and one of the most respected of the. He was in the Congress at the time, and probably one of the most respected members of Congress, and a good friend of. He had been a real ally of Alexander Hamilton's. He had been instrumental in writing the U.S. Constitution. They wrote the Federalist Papers largely together that helped facilitate the ratification of the Constitution. And Madison and Hamilton worked together to transfer the tariff revenue from the state governments to the federal government and to write the new legislation we'll talk about in a little bit to write the new tariff revenue. But when Hamilton comes out with this plan to refund the existing debt and to then to assume the state debts and to federalize the state debts, Madison comes out sharply against this. And many other congressmen and members of Congress come out sharply against this. They argue that current market values are well below the face values. These bonds are now trading about 20 cents on the dollar. And so if this debt is to be funded at par or even close to par, it's largely going to be the speculators who earn the high returns. Now, recall when we talked about, the government had issued all of these IOUs in the early 1780s. They wrote these IOUs to soldiers, to suppliers, to various people who they owed money to. many people were not in a position where they could simply hold on to these pieces of paper and see, and wait and see if these things ever get returned or get redeemed. Many of them were sold off to speculators or liquidity providers, and so the folks that are going to benefit in large by this this sharp increase in tax revenue that's going to then be used to be a big transfer from the taxpayer to the bondholder is not going to go to the original holders of the debt, the patriots that really did fund the American Revolution. Instead, it's going to go to these speculators. You hear this exact same argument today about the deal the deal on Puerto Rican debt. Puerto Rican, the people who originally bought the Puerto Rico's debt. Puerto Rico was in a fiscal crisis. It still is, but it was in a sharp fiscal crisis. Just couldn't make its coupon payments several months ago. Earlier this year, and the people who originally bought those bonds had all sold ultimately to hedge funds, and so any deal to bail out Puerto Rico was essentially to bail out hedge funds, not necessarily the citizens of Puerto Rico. So this bailout plan of Hamilton's, or this plan to resolve this fiscal crisis, the beneficiaries are not going to be the soldiers who fought in the revolution. They're going to be the speculators or the liquidity providers that these soldiers then sold to. And so James Madison comes up with a counterproposal that he's going to call a discrimination plan. And in that report on public credit, Hamilton goes into length arguing about why this is not a good idea. But what Madison's idea is to go back and go look at all the records and try to partially reimburse all the original bondholders, and then pay for what they were owed, and then pay the remaining fraction of the face value to the final purchasers. He has this idea that the original bondholders, the people who these bonds were originally written to, should share in these gains, these capital gains that are going to occur, should not accrue just to the people who own them now, but the people who originally held them. Well, in Hamilton's report on the public credit, he comes out sharply against this plan. He says, look, this is an administrative nightmare. It would be nearly impossible to try to go track down who all these original bondholders are, try to find all these records, find out who they are. And furthermore, and this is where Hamilton, having understood financial markets, whereas Madison and Jefferson don't understand financial markets at all, like Hamilton says, look, this is going to be a breach of contract that would set a bad precedent. That would mean, how could you ever think about carrying out a financial contract if you could then go back and rewrite contracts? I mean, just think, if we could go back and say, gee, I always wish I could have, back 5 years ago, I intended to invest in Google, but I somehow didn't get around to it. I'd like to go back and rewrite my contract, and invest in Google. And so he says, this is if a deal's a deal. When you sell a security, you sell a security, and you don't get to go and take things back and say, well, if a price of a security goes up later, and you had sold, well, tough luck. And furthermore, he says, look, if you do this, then basically you're punishing government creditors who would bet that the U.S. would eventually honor its debt. He said, the folks who sold were essentially betting against the United States. Their loss. The people who bought these securities were putting their faith that the U.S. government would pay, and that these liquidity providers, these speculators, are indeed patriots themselves for betting on the United States. Now, Hamilton does, in fact, though, discriminate along another dimension, and that is he wants some debt to be very highly valued, and he says that these are going to provide a liquid store of value. very much. And he lists a variety of reasons why it's important in that report on public credit, why it's important for this debt to be well funded. And he says, look, he said for a number of reasons. One is it's going to provide a liquid store of value. You're going to be able to you're going to be able to hold debt, and debt, as we're going to see in a minute, is going to have many of the same properties as money. That there's a lot of beneficiary if you know that you're much more willing to accept something as a means of payment if you know that you can then turn around and spend it use it as a means of payment. Secondly, by having a highly valued debt, it's going to increase the credibility of the United States when it needs to return to the credit markets. It says this is not going to be the last time we need to borrow money. There's going to be other times where we need to borrow money. And the reason why we want to repay, and we want to repay the bondholders in full, is because at some point we're going to need to come back and borrow. And the third thing he does is he talks about creating a political constituency, i.e. the bondholders, who are going to support a strong federal government. And they're going to support the strong government with a robust, they're going to back a robust source of tax revenue on that, which is going to create a strong federal government. He doesn't want a weak federal government. He fought in a war in which there was a weak central government, and that war, the soldiers suffered. They were underfunded. They were under-equipped. And he says, we need if we're going to be a great nation, we need to have a strong, well-funded federal government. We need a political constituency that's going to support a strong, well-funded federal government. The bondholders will be one of those political constituencies. Now, there's several different classes of bondholders. And what's interesting is there was a view in the 1780s that different domestic creditors would be treated differently. There was this idea that the loan-off certificates were sort of the high-quality debt, whereas debts like those paid to the soldiers were of lower quality. It's interesting. He's going to treat all of the domestic bondholders the same. They're going to receive something less than face value, which we'll talk about in a minute. Actually, only one group is going to be truly repaid at par, and that's going to be the foreign debtors. And it's as often is the case in these fiscal crises, foreign debtors are often treated much better than the domestics. You'll see this happens in the United States, and it happens time and time and time again. Now, one question is, well, if he repaid the bondholders at something near face value, if not complete face value, why didn't he do the same thing for the holders of the bills of credit? And it's interesting when you think about that government budget constraint. You can kind of think, well, there's, how can a government raise revenue? Well, it can tax, can issue bonds, or it can issue money. And Hamilton believes that giving a government the power to issue money it creates a time inconsistency problem. It is always going to be a temptation to issue just a little bit more money, to issue a little bit more money, to issue a little bit more money, and create inflation, and that a government can't be trusted to issue fiat currency. And so that, future administrations, if you give the government the power to issue fiat currency, it'll be tempted to do so, and it'll run another hyperinflation. There's quite a bit of discussion in the Constitutional Convention, and it's interesting. There's a hyperlink here, on this page, to the Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. We won't look to them, but if you want to take a look at them, which there's a long discussion about whether the Constitution should give the federal government the right to issue fiat currency, or whether it should prohibit the federal government from issuing fiat currency. You'll note that the states are not allowed. They're explicitly prohibited from issuing fiat currency. But it's interesting. They can't make up their mind whether to. They can't come to a consensus on whether whether the federal government should or should not be able to issue fiat currency. Hamilton wanted it forbidden. So he is sort of the master politician. He doesn't get his way with the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is silent on this, doesn't take a stand. It's kind of interesting. They can't agree, so they just leave it blank and decide to not, whether they're going to issue. They don't decide one way or the other whether the government can or can't do it. So he's going to essentially ruin the reputation of federally issued fiat currency by defaulting on it. By defaulting by a factor of 99%. That every promise to pay $1 in a bill of credit is now only worth a penny. He's going to poison that reputation, and so nobody in the future will ever accept U.S. government money, fiat money. That's the way to do it. He loses the battle in the Constitutional Convention, but then he becomes Secretary of Treasury, and he ruins the reputation. So that's going to, by ruining that reputation to issuing fiat currency, he basically he makes it so nobody would ever accept this stuff in the future, and that's a way of forcing not only his hand but the hand of all future Treasury secretaries to not issue fiat money in order to finance government expenditures on that. Now, it's often said that Hamilton refunded the debt at par. If you look at most U.S. history textbooks, and indeed my daughter's U.S. history textbook says this, that Hamilton paid its debt at face value. They'll say the youthful financier's first objective was to bolster the nation's credit. Without public confidence in the government, Hamilton could not secure the funds with which to float his risky schemes. I love the way they say risky schemes. He therefore boldly urged Congress to fund the entire national debt at par and to assume completely the debts incurred by the states during the recent war. Funding at par meant that the federal government would pay off its debt at face value, plus accumulated interest of an enormous total of more than $54 million. So this idea that the debt was paid completely at face value, it's not quite right. So let's talk about that. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So in terms of the politics, the way it goes, so the first vote on the refunding of the debt, it passes easily. So the refunding the domestic debt into these three new securities, that goes through and funds, goes and passes pretty easily. But then there's a second vote on the assumption of the state debts, and it fails the first time. And it's not clear it's going to pass, and there's quite a bit of political drama on this. What happens, it's a great story, it's a great political story, is Thomas Jefferson proposes a dinner on Maiden Lane there in New York, and Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, they sit and they cut a deal. The federal government will assume the state debts, but in return, the federal capital will be moved out of New York City. So New York City is going to lose, is the capital at the time in 1790. It's going to lose the capital. The capital is going to move initially to Philadelphia, and then in 1800, it will move to a new city on the Potomac River, which will be known as Washington, D.C. So Madison and Jefferson, who are opposed to the assumption of these state debts, say, okay, you can assume the state debts, but we're going to get the capital. They're Virginians, and they're going to basically force Hamilton, who's from New York, he's now got to come to the South in order to carry the capital. And at a time when travel is quite difficult, having the capital, right near a southern city is going to help empower Virginia and it will try to hope, with the idea that trying to move power away from New York and back into Virginia by doing that. So it's a trade. This assumption of state debts actually gets two songs in the Hamilton musical. So first it's, and maybe during the break we'll listen to it. First is this cabinet battle number 1. And then the second song on this deal is probably one of the most famous songs from the musical, "The Room Where It Happened." Is about this dinner. The cabinet battle number 1 is where he loses the first vote, and then the room where it happened is about this dinner. That's that. Now, part of this idea on this refunding scheme is part of the goal in this refunding scheme is to align the interests of the money men with those of the federal government. What Hamilton wants to do is move the political interests away from the state governments and toward the federal government. He wants a well-funded federal government that's going to ensure repayment. And so thus he wants to tie the financiers to the federal government. Jefferson's going to argue that this strengthens the bankers by doing this, whereas Hamilton's going to argue, in contrast, that it's going to strengthen the federal government. Jefferson's also going to go on. There was somebody, one of the students talked about borrowing with interest. Said, how was borrowing on interest perceived, and how the shift from perceiving as immoral to openly talking about it on an institutional level? How did it happen? Well, here's kind of the way it happened. So Jefferson thinks this is highly immoral. He's going to argue against this. He's going to say this is a very immoral act, and argue that this borrowing is going to strengthen the bankers' hands. It's strengthening the rich. Hold on one second. I'm losing power. It's going to strengthen the interests of the rich at the expense of the taxpayer and of the federal government. Whereas Hamilton's going to argue that it's going to strengthen the federal government by having the financial interests support the federal government. It's going to be there, and he's going to argue this is highly moral. It's also going to create a perception of a free rider problem between the state and the central government. It's going to be, in the 1790 bailout of the states is going to create this view that the federal government stands behind state debts and is prepared to bail out state debts. We're going to see, someone asked about this, another student asked about this in their response to the readings. We're going to see that in a debt crisis, it's going to sort of sow some seeds of a debt crisis 50 years later, in which the federal government will not bail out the state governments. And so let me defer the question about this, about what happened in the 1830s and 1840s another week or two, but we'll see that this free rider problem is going to get created. It's going to, the decisions made in 1790 are going to have implications for a fiscal crisis 50 years later. The other thing this is going to do, what's going to be interesting, is by refunding the debt and creating a debt, creating a well-funded debt, it's going to create what's in the language today known as fiscal space. And that is, it's going to give the federal government sort of room to borrow as it needs, and thus help finance an increase in federal spending. Another thing that Thomas Jefferson's going to be horrified with in a second. There. So if we look at the composition of the U.S. debt from 1775 to 1805, we can see, well, there's kind of two ways we can think about it. One is the magnitude. I mean, first of all, just look at the magnitude of the default of the continental dollar. There's kind of two defaults if you draw it this way. So first of all, there's a default here in 1780. And then there's a second default on the continental dollar here in 1790. But it's very tiny. It's basically going from, they promised exchanging the continental dollars into Spanish dollars 1-for-1 prior to 1780. Then it went to 40-1, and then it went to 100-1 in there. And you'll see that that default is enormous, and it just sort of swamps. It swamps everything relative to the size of the interest-bearing debt. This idea that all the debt was funded at par, you quickly realize, no, the Revolutionary War was largely funded by a default. It was largely borrowed a huge amount of money. Through the continental dollar, and then defaulted on it. Now, and then you can see that this domestic principal and the domestic interest, you can see the growing unpaid interest and the foreign interest, the foreign loans. It's largely domestic loans, and then it gets refinanced into these three different securities: the 3%, the deferred 6%, and the 6% stock here. There's the assumption of the state debts, which does increase the quantity of the debt, and you see the refunding there. One of the things that doesn't become clear in this graph is that this green area in domestic principal, this area here, this is really made up of dozens of different types of issues, of different types of securities, and then that are then collapsed into these three main securities: the 6%, the deferred 6%, and the 3% on that. We can also think, though, Hamilton did have, he could have alternatively, and many, the holders of the continental dollar said, hey, if you're gonna repay the interest-bearing debt at face value or something close to face value, how about us? Why not repay the bills of credit why not repay the bills of credit at face value? And if they had honored the bills of credit at face value, he could have. That would have been a choice. Had he done it, that would have been the size of the instead, if we want to say, sort of put the default on Hamilton and say he could have honored it at face value, continental dollars could have valued, then the quantity of debt outstanding, actually the face value of all of these pieces of paper, the specie value, if they were valued 1-to-1, would have been this. And then that's the magnitude of the default on that. Well, let me just take another minute. I realized I've run a little bit over of where time's gotten away from me here. I'll just show you real quick what these 6%, this is a 3% stock of these 3% bonds. This one's made out, you'll notice, out to George Washington of the county of Fairfax. That's what a 3% bond, 3% stock looked like. That's actually at the Museum of American Finance down there on Wall Street. It's on display. They were kind enough to send me this image on that. And there's a 6% stock that was taken out of the Massachusetts Historical Society on that. So why don't we, I guess we'll stop here. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll get going. And if people have questions, we should feel free to ask. And I can even maybe I'll play a couple of videos or a couple of raps from the Hamilton musical. Does that sound good? Okay. So see you all in 10 minutes. Okay.